Greetings, Pasadenians and all my heroes everywhere. What do Shavuot, kosher wine, and the continuous growth of Torah have to do with each other? Let's find out together. I'm your friendly neighborhood Rabbi John Carrier, the Rabbi of Pasadena Jewish Temple and Center. And this is my contribution to this year's, what are we calling this? Shavuot at PJTC, our Tikkun Shavuot. Sometimes we learn a lot of Torah together over the course of an evening on Erev Shavuot. This year, we're doing a lot of things a little bit differently, but I'm really excited about all the great learning that we're doing in this initiative. So what I wanted to talk about is kosher wine, a favorite subject of mine. I got my prop right here. You'll see it's a bottle of Manischewitz, barely used. I like, I'm a fan of wine. This one's mostly for Haroset, so it's safe in our cabinet. So let's go on. What exactly we're going to be talking about? Let's see. We're going to talk a little bit about Shavuot, the holiday itself, its origin, and its, let's say, its original meaning and its enduring meaning, and how that meaning has grown and evolved over time. We're going to spend a little time talking about kosher wine, specifically the opinions of three rabbis from old Algiers. In the 1300s and 1400s, there was a series of head rabbis of the Jewish community of Algiers, and people would ask them questions. Is this wine kosher? This happened. Is the wine still kosher? And we can see through their reasoning how Torah continues to grow. And that's what I wanted to give you today. And what does that have to do with Shavuot? I mean, we get the Torah. Isn't it just the same Torah forever? Or do we, let's say, harvest new fruits from this tree of life every single year? I think you probably can guess my opinion. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. This year, if you're watching this in the year 5780 or the Gregorian year of 2020, what a year it is being. Shavuot begins at sundown, Thursday, May 28th. That's this coming Thursday if you're watching this video when it drops. There will be services, let's say from PJTC, not at PJTC, but I'll be at PJTC and we'll be live streaming services Friday morning at 9:30, Friday evening, which is sort of a joint Shavuot Shabbat service on Friday evening at 7:30 p.m. And again, a joint Shavuot Shabbat mashup on Saturday morning at 9:30 a.m. And you can get those wherever you usually watch our live streaming services on StreamSpot, Facebook Live, YouTube Live, however you join us, please join us. It's going to be great. So also make sure you check out the rest of the videos in this Shavuot at PJTC series. You can go to our YouTube page, which you're probably already familiar with if you're watching this. And there's a playlist on there called Shavuot at PJTC. This is along with about another 5 or 6 videos, great teachers on all sorts of great topics. I highly encourage you to check them out. And before we begin our study together, I always like starting Torah study with a blessing. And it's just the same kind of blessing we would say over doing any kind of mitzvah. We bless God who makes our lives special with commandments, including the commandment to engage in Torah study together. And I'm going to say the blessing, and you can just say amen after me, or you can say it along with me, you do you. And it goes a little something like this. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. All right, before we get into it, I need a little sip of the Move juice here, a little Folgers. Good stuff. So we're going to talk first about Shavuot itself, in case you're unfamiliar, or maybe you could use a refresher. That's okay. I got to review stuff a lot myself, including how to use Zoom to record videos. So we first see this holiday in the Torah. I have a hypothesis, and I'm not alone in this, that this was probably a holiday, let's say already. There was a cycle of agriculture in the ancient Near East, of which our people were a part, where the grain harvest would happen over the period of a few weeks. Usually there's the first thing that comes in. I'm not a farmer, but I read this someplace. The first thing that comes in that part of the world is barley. And then you harvest your barley, and over time, other grains are coming in, and then it concludes about 7 weeks later with the wheat harvest, or wheat, if you pronounce the H, the wheat harvest. So over the course of 7 weeks, we start with barley, we end with wheat, and this is how grain is produced. And we use grain for all sorts of stuff. We use it for bread. We use it for matzah if the need arises. It's made into other dishes with parched grains and whatnot mentioned in the Torah. Beer, I will say, you thought this was a wine show. Beer is also made with grain and all sorts of other delicious beverages. So it's important to have that background that this was probably something that people were celebrating anyway, because harvest has always been an occasion for celebration. Even a bad harvest, you're like, this is as good as it gets. Let's celebrate. So we read about it at least 3 or 4 different places in the Torah where it has different names. The first time we hear about it, and this is sort of maybe right after the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments first appears about chapter 20 in Exodus. By 23, we're reading a list of holidays, and what is going to be Shavuot is called Hag HaKatzir, meaning the festival. Katzir is the verb is to reap grain, like to cut the tops off of grain, and then you grind that up and make bread out of it. And so Hag HaKatzir, it's like this is the reaping festival. Like we're done with grain harvest for the year, and it happens a certain number of days after Pesach. Fun fact, Shavuot is the only holiday that's mentioned in the Torah where the date isn't said explicitly. Pesach is supposed to happen in the full moon of the month of Nisan, or Aviv as it says, which is later Nisan. We get a date for Rosh Hashanah, we get a date for Yom Kippur, we get a date for Sukkot. Shavuot, it just says, okay, you start with Pesach, and right after Pesach, you're going to count 7 weeks, or a week of weeks. That's where we get the name weeks. 7 weeks, and then the next day, that 50th day, is going to be a holiday. And the rabbis of the Talmud called it atzeret, because what atzeret means to hold back, and they said you should hold back. It also means assembly, so you could either, as you should assemble and hold back from your work. And so it doesn't say that Shavuot is on a certain day. We'll get to that. It says that you should start with Passover, count this number of days, and then have a celebration. And at first, it's just called the reaping festival. Later on in Exodus 34, and then this name is repeated in Deuteronomy chapter 16, it's called Chag HaShavuot, the Festival of Weeks, right? That's where we get the name from. Otherwise, we'd be celebrating Tikkun Leil Hagatz Katzir. So I'm glad this one stuck, because it's already printed on all the calendars. And then later on, once again in the book of Numbers, in Parashat Pinchas, where we have the listing of holidays. That's why every time there's a special day, we have a maftir that's not from the regular Torah reading. We take out a different scroll, and it's always bookmarked to Parashat Pinchas, which lists all the holidays and the different sacrifices and offerings you're supposed to make for those holidays. And in Pinchas, it's called Yom HaBikurim, which means bikurim is the first fruits, meaning when you're harvesting, you set some aside because you owe God kind of a debt of gratitude for the abundance that you have. And you don't take that off the back end. God has first draw on that. If there are any bankers out there, you set aside the beginning of your crop for the glory of God, and not wait and see how it goes, and then we'll see what we're going to contribute. I think that portrays a huge amount of faith to take your offering out of the beginning of your crop, even though you don't know exactly how your crop's going to turn out. Probably have an idea if you've been farming for a while, which I haven't. So as far as the Torah is concerned, this is predominantly a harvest festival. This is an agricultural celebration. But by the time we get into the classical rabbinical period in the Talmud, it's talking about, no, this isn't just about, simply about, I'll say, because it's a big deal. This isn't simply about blessing God and bringing first fruits and getting together to party because of crops, right? Because everybody knows, asterisk, we'll get to that, everybody knows that this time that Shavuot is occurring also happens to be the same day that God first spoke the 10 Commandments to the Jewish people gathered at Mount Sinai. And there's an asterisk on there because there's a little debate in the Talmud. I don't know if you've met the Talmud, uh, but they have debates on Shabbat, in the second Shabbat, page 86, side B. Most rabbis agree that the Ten Commandments was given on the 6th of Sivan. And there's one holdout. Rabbi Yossi says, no, I'm pretty sure it was the 7th. I don't know how you did your math, but I'm going to go with the 7th, and I'll die on this hill. Like, it's the 7th. But everybody's like, oh, let's just put it on the calendar as the 6th. What's also interesting is the reason why this was debatable, and the reason perhaps why there's no date given for Shavuot, is that it might be on a different day every year. Back in the day, before we had fixed calendars, the new moon was declared every month by somebody looking at the moon and saying it's a new month. And so depending on, who's keeping watch and what the moon looks like, and the moon, doesn't play by our rules necessarily, it turned out that Shavuot, 50 days after Pesach, might have been celebrated on the 5th or the 6th or the 7th of Sivan. But since the rabbis concluded that year, the 50th day happened to coincide with the day that the Torah was given, which was the 6th of Sivan. 7th, said Rabbi Yossi. That's why to this day, regardless of where the new moon actually appears, we celebrate Shavuot on the 6th of Sivan. And this might seem like a bit of a walk, right? This might seem like, how do we get there from here of having a harvest festival that then becomes a celebration of revelation, of God letting letting us know what God wants of us. As I often call this cycle of the year, we move from Pesach to Shavuot. Now we're free. We can do anything we want. How do we get to understand what should we do? And that is the benefit of revelation, which we have come to celebrate. So you might ask, and I might answer, what does the giving of Torah, which happened one time in the Torah, have to do with a harvest that renews itself every single year? So before we get too deep into that, let's talk about another kind of crop, grapes. So let's get into it. This is based on a project that I did many years ago. It was actually my capstone thesis for rabbinical school. I hope you won't mind me dusting off some old homework here. But to this day, it's been one of the most enduring pieces of learning that I've learned. And it taught me a whole lot about not just Jewish history, rabbinic history, the details of the kashrut of wine, but has also informed my sensibility to a great extent as to how Jewish law works and how we can make Jewish law work for us today, right? How we apply our tradition to our lives in ways that dignify the tradition and elevate our lives. And to help me out with that, I'm going to bring in my three friends, Rabbi Yitzhak ben Sheshet Parfit, Rabbi Shimon ben Simach Duran, and Rabbi Shlomo, forgot the Shlomo there, Rabbi Shlomo ben Shimon Duran. And so I don't know if you know this about rabbis, they all had cute nicknames, right? You may have heard of Rashi or the Rambam. These were actually acronyms because most of these guys had like the same, there's only like 4 or 5 popular Jewish names in different combinations. And they're like, oh, this Rabbi Shimon, that Rabbi Shimon. So instead they would call them by an acronym of, usually starting with a R, for Rebbe, and then their patronymic. And so Rabbi Yitzhak ben Sheshet becomes the Rivash. Rabbi Shimon ben Semach becomes the Rashbats. And then my personal favorite, Rabbi Shlomo ben Shimon, becomes the Rashbash, right? That just like Rashbash, bebop, bop, bam, bam. I think it just trips off the tongue. And it turns out, I discovered these guys. I was just looking for good tshuvot or good halachic discussions, good legal responsa on wine. And I came across 3 great ones. And then when I dug into who their authors were, what I discovered was these 3 great tshuvot about wine were written by essentially a dynasty of rabbis of the same community. And the first 2 of these folks, the Rivash and the Rashbats, were born in Spain. And then because of the difficulties that Jews had in Spain, there were multiple expulsions and forced conversions and things like that. There was a particular bad year. I don't know if you've ever had a bad year. There's a particular bad year of 1391 of the Common Era of expulsions of various parts of Spain, including around the island of Mallorca and Barcelona, or around Barcelona and Mallorca and islands in that area. And during this time, two different rabbis were expelled from a couple of different parts of Spain. First, Rabbi Yitzhak ben Sheshet was expelled from Spain. First, he was, let's say, forcibly converted on pain of death, and he chose to live. But then, within a year after that whole mess, he met up with another person, Hastai Crespi, and was kind of smuggled out of Spain back into a Jewish community where he resumed living a Jewish life, just completely disavowed that sort of detour, and then made his way to Algiers, where he was recruited to become he was a great renowned scholar from his part of Spain. He was recruited to become the rabbi of Algiers. At the same time, that expulsion of Rabbi Yitzhak, where he kind of escaped during that period of 1391, another guy, Shimon ben Semach, was expelled from a different part of Spain, kind of went around the Mediterranean basin a little bit, also wound up in Algiers, but he wanted to continue his rabbinic studies. And so he took on as a teacher Rabbi Yitzhak ben Sheshet. So the guy who was the Rosh Yeshiva in Algiers took on Rabbi Shimon ben Semach as his student. And then when the Rivash retired in 1407, the Rashbats succeeded him as the head rabbi of Algiers. And then before he took the big chair, a few years before he took the big chair, the Rashbats had a son, and the son was the Rashbash, was Rabbi Shlomo. And Rabbi Shlomo followed in his father's footsteps. And then when his father retired, the Rashbash became the head of the head rabbi of Algiers. It was not the same as the head of Algiers. They like to keep the political leaders and the rabbinic leaders separate, even back then, for good reason. And so these were three successive rabbis who were responsible for the people of Algiers, and each of them got a curious question about wine. Hey, Rabbi, we had something and something happened to our wine. Can we still drink it? Can we still make Kiddush with it? And so I'll give these are sort of long, detailed legal discussions. I'm going to give you the safe. I'm going to give you the conclusions and some insights along the way. First, a little background. Algiers was not Spain. I mean, these folks, the first two guys, came from just centuries-old academies in that part of the world. Jews had really prospered under Muslim rule in certain parts of Spain and had established houses of learning and undertook great feats of scholarship. And this was Spain was like the big city for the rabbis, and Algiers was, as one of my teachers would call it, Yechupitzville, right? This was the backwater. This is where you didn't want to get a job as a rabbi. You were so far from Jewish learning. The people were far removed from knowledgeable Jewish practice. And so you would get these questions. You're like, hey, nobody in Spain would ever ask this question. And yet it required a great amount of trust in the rabbi and also a great amount of empathy on the part of the rabbi. Like, these folks don't have access to the same resources that I did in Spain. They don't have the same scholarship. My job is to help them live the Jewish lives that they want to live. And you'll see that in kind of how the legal decisions come out. The other thing you should understand is that the kashrut of wine is, in my opinion, about the most complicated area of kashrut. It's a little bit like Passover. You got kosher, and then you got kosher for Passover. You've got rules for meat and milk, and then you got rules for wine. More than any other, let's say, beverage. Beer, didn't care too much about beer. Spirits, pretty much most distilled spirits were kosher as long as it didn't come from grapes. Anything made from grapes, you got to be careful. In part because grapes that were used predominantly for wine, California raisins weren't as big back then. Grapes were a common commodity among Jewish people and non-Jewish people. And the primary concern was that because we use wine in our rituals and non-Jews also use wine in their rituals, the concern was that if a non-Jew had possession of Jewish wine for some period of time, they might use that in their religious rituals, right? And so if they use it in their religious rituals, do we want to take the leftovers? Like, do we want to then turn around and use it again in our religious rituals? Or do we want to keep this wine safe with the intention of Avodat Hashem versus what they called Avodah Zarah, or foreign worship? In fact, a lot of the kosher wine comes out of Masechet Avodah Zarah, which has to do with limitations on idolatry. And so the big concern in each of these cases is we had wine that was intended for Jewish use. There was the potential or actual contact with this wine and a person who wasn't Jewish. And the fear wasn't that like non-Jews give the wine cooties. Forget about that stuff. The idea was that, okay, given the opportunity, they might have used that wine in their rituals, and so it's no longer appropriate for use in Jewish rituals, right? It's for Zeus now. We can't control that. And so in each of these cases, that was the concern, and they each get a case, and they each answer it with something that gives me a little bit of insight into Jewish law that I want to pass on to you. The first case was before the Rivash, and somebody sent him a letter. This is how it usually went, right? Jewish law was always very kind of person to person, right? It wasn't for the most part. The clear stuff was clear. They had law codes, they had Torah, but it's always the fringe cases. And they would write a letter to their rabbi, and the rabbi would scratch his head. He says, I don't know. And then he would write a letter to his rabbi, and so on. And then the decision would come back down. And again, the decision was an opinion. There was no like force of, beatings or anything like that. So somebody wrote the Rivash a letter saying, okay, so my cousin was making wine, and this was sort of open pit maceration or processing or whatever. You see the pictures of the big barrel where people were, stepping on the wine with their feet, and hopefully they washed their feet, I hope. And so this guy was mashing the grapes with his feet, and it was starting to ferment, and there were fumes, and he passed out, right? He just passed out, bloop, right in the bucket. And as he's like going down, he cries out for help. And this guy, this really nice guy across the street, runs in to help him and reaches out his arm and pulls him out. He grabs him by the arm and pulls him out of the wine. And then there was a bystander, I guess a Jewish person, who didn't stop to help this guy, but saw this all happen. And he says, I heard there's a rule that, non-Jews aren't supposed to touch our wine in its processing. And is that wine okay? And Rabbi Shimon, so first off, goes into this long spiel about, okay, you're right to be careful. There's a well-known thing that, okay, when we have kosher wine, it should be made by people who have the intent of using it for Jewish purposes. You shouldn't even have somebody who wouldn't use it for Jewish purposes even stir it with a stick or use a stick to shoo away wasps, which is a problem with open fermentation, I guess. So they're like, it wasn't the non-Jewish person using the Jewish person as a stick to stir the wine as he's pulling him out. And after much hemming and hawing, the Rivash says, Tepesh, a person is not a stick, right? This isn't the same, just pulling somebody out. And yes, the wine gets disturbed. It's kind of like stirring it. But he's saving his life. First off. Second off, he's a human being in that wine, right? When it comes to making decisions about the right way to do Jewish things, people are not objects. Every human being is created in the image of God and should be and deserves the dignity thereof. All the more so, he's not a stick. Drink the wine. From the Rivash's student, the Rashbats, we get probably my favorite of these three, just for the story. And he gets a letter. It's a story of daring do and sea travels and pirates and the whole bit. What happens is there's a shipment of wine going to, I believe it was Sardinia. And so there's a shipment. There's a ship going to Sardinia. There's a barrel of kosher wine. And what happened was the barrel of kosher wine was loaded onto the ship. So there was the barrel was loaded onto the ship. It wasn't just a Jewish ship. It wasn't just Jewish kosher stuff in there. There was a barrel of Jewish wine with everything else. So the barrel of kosher wine goes into the hold of the ship, and then all the other cargo is packed on top of it. And the custom was, just to make sure that nobody used this wine and poured one out for Zeus, as it were, there was a shomer. There was a guy, a Jewish guy, who was on the boat, and his job was to guard the wine. Well, about halfway through the trip, there was word of pirates. And they said, you got to be careful. These waters are infested with pirates. And I guess, Johnny Depp's in there and the whole bit. And so the shomer for the wine, the Jewish guy, it fears for his life and gets off the boat. And so when the boat gets to Sardinia, to the Jewish community in this little island, they're like, where's Steve? Like, where's the shomer, right? They're, well, here's your wine, but there's no Steve. They're like, no guard. Like, are we allowed to drink this? And they add in the fun fact, second off, it's Elul, right? On the one hand, because it's, almost fall, the seas are about to get rough, and it's almost high holidays, which means this is the last possible shipment of wine before the high holidays. Can we drink this wine? And so what the Rashbats noted, he looks through the data and he says, wait a minute, you told me they put the wine on first and packed everything else on top of it. There's no way that anybody could have gotten in and uncorked that wine, poured one out for Zeus, and went on with their day. Be practical, people. He's like, yeah, I get it. Usually you like to see Steve at the end of the journey, but kashrut can be practical, right? Kashrut can take into account the facts of the case. It doesn't have to be, okay, and this was what kind of grinds my gears sometimes, and I'll confess that sometimes when we're trying to observe kashrut for our sake and for the sake of other people, we lose sight of practicality and we lose trust in people. And we think, okay, if we don't watch every single thing the whole time, we must assume something's gone wrong and throw everything out. And the Rashbats in the 1400s says, that's bogus. Look at the facts of the case. Practically speaking, there's no way that anything is wrong with this wine. And Lashana Tova, like, have this wine. It's it's ready for Rosh Hashanah. It's kosher for after Yom Kippur, and everything's going to be fine. Kashrut can be practical. You don't have to drive yourself and the people around you crazy. And finally, we get to the Rashbash. Now, the Rashbash, different from the other two guys, was actually born in Algeria. So he wasn't, the guy from the big city who got stuck in Yehupetzville and made the best of it. He was born in Yehupetzville, right? He was a native rabbi for the people that he was serving. And he got this question that is still a part of the the Jewish experience today. The question was, when they had wine, they didn't, they were very mindful of recycling, I guess, because they didn't have the mass production that we have today. And even if they had, they would reuse bottles over and over again. And often bottles were stoneware, earthenware, things like that. And they would reuse these bottles. And to the extent that they would even use bottles that had held non-kosher wine before. There was a procedure for rinsing it out a couple of times, and then you could put kosher wine in there and it's fine. And so there's no chance of the kosher wine being mingled with stuff that might have been used in a non-Jewish ritual. The question was, I have somebody in my, I have an employee whose job it is to, let's say I own a vineyard. I have an employee whose job it is to wash out the bottles, uh, but he's not Jewish. And so the question is, can a person who is not Jewish kosher the bottles to be used for kosher wine, right? Just like we may take pots and pans or some dishes and things like that and kosher them, make them fit for use in a kosher setting, just like we kosher our kitchens for Passover, right? We take the normal kitchen, we do a bunch of stuff, sometimes involving boiling water, sometimes a blowtorch. I recommend a clothing steamer as the safest option. And we have so many people in our communities who help us live our Jewish lives who aren't Jewish. I'm thinking of not just, custodial staff in temples, administrative staff in temples, volunteers at temples who aren't Jewish, the non-Jewish members of Jewish families who drive their kids to Hebrew school, who support Jewish education, who should support the spiritual journey of their Jewish spouse. We have so many people helping us be Jewish, who, for whatever reason, aren't a part of the covenant yet. If we can't trust them, what are we even doing? Because they've already demonstrated they're not trying to mess with how we're being Jewish or how we're doing Jewish. And this is the Rashbash's conclusion, that trust is kosher. Right. This, again, we go back to, oh, there wasn't somebody watching the barrel on the ship, let's all throw everything out. At some point, you have to choose between a disposition of what's the maximum amount of suspicion of everything. If not everything is perfect and watched all the time, of course something's going to go wrong. To, I know the right way that I want to proceed. The people who love me and who care for me and who take care of me know the right way to proceed. I can trust that nobody is trying to interfere with my spiritual journey, just like I wouldn't interfere with their spiritual journey. Can we trust folks? And the Rashbash, 600 years ago, is saying loud and clear, yes, trust is kosher. So what does that have to do with Shavuot? On Shavuot, we get the revelation of the Torah at Mount Sinai in the form of the 10 Commandments. So basically, the people were asking Moses for his opinion on everything. He would go talk to God and talk to the people. It was a whole game of telephone. It was exhausting for everybody. And eventually, God just said, okay, look, bring the people to the mountain. I'm going to tell them what's what. And you can explain some of it, but they need to hear this from me. And they need to take ownership of it. And so God starts with the 10 Commandments. And the people are like, thank you, that's super loud. Can you just write down the rest of it? And that's how we get the rest of the Torah. But in the Torah itself, in Sefer Devarim, in the book of Deuteronomy, there is this great line, Torah lo b'shamayim hi. The Torah is not in heaven. The intent of this verse is, the Torah isn't across the sea that you can't reach it. The Torah is not in heaven, that it's only for angels and you can't access it. It's in your very mouths and it's in your very heart. It belongs to you. And later on in Baba Metzia on page 59 and side B, the rabbis are having this debate with each other. And one rabbi says, if I'm right, let the voice come from heaven and prove that I'm right. And the clouds part and it says, he's right. And the rest of the rabbis are like, Lo b'shamayim hi. God gave us this Torah. We are going to interpret it the right way for this case. And the Torah tells us that that's okay. Going through these Tshuvot helped me understand that Jewish law is at its best the living interface between heavenly ideals and real life. Some people take a look at Jewish law and say, it's, Hoyle's rules of card games. It's all punctilious. And can I just be a good person? Da, 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 da. And I don't need all this I don't need all of these things. And it's too hard. It's for saints and monks and men. And in some cases, why should I bother? But I've come to see that each of us has these sort of two centers of gravity pulling at us at once. One is we want to live by our highest ideals. And for many of us, that means we want to live the life that God laid out for us in the Torah. And we have human lives. Some of us have kids. Thank God some of us have jobs. Most of us have taxes. All of us have tzoros, right? We have to negotiate this real world in a human body with human relationships. And that's a holy thing too. We're given these bodies because souls can't do mitzvot without them. And so at every point I see Jewish law as being that interface. What's the compromise between living a heavenly life and living a human life? Can you get together and light candles once a week? Can you get rid of your bread for a 1 week a year? And that's how you join those two spheres that draw your existence. Furthermore, we see that all Jewish law is case by case involving real people in real situations trying to do their best. It's not some abstraction. The Torah was given to humans so that humans could figure out how to distinguish between what's good for them and what's bad for them, how to distinguish between what's helpful behavior and harmful behavior, and why it's holy to not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor, why it's holy to set aside part of your harvest for the poor, which P.S. gives us the book of Ruth that Rabbi Jason Mann gives a great teaching on in this series. But it's given to human beings, and every interface of law is a real person with a real problem trying to do the very best that they can, and occasionally teachers trying to give the best advice that they can. What occurs to me this year, it never dawned on me till this year thinking about this, every single week on Saturday morning, we sing this song, Etz Chaim Chi, right? It's at the end of the Torah, so Etz Chaim Chi, which means it's a tree of life. It's talking about the Torah. And even our big burgundy book that we read is called Etz Chaim, right? The tree of life. But if we're going to call it a tree of life, we have to acknowledge that it grows. Its roots get deeper, its trunk gets taller and thicker, its branches extend to the heavens, and every year it bears new fruit. Otherwise, it's not a tree of life. It's petrified wood. It is a fossil. And that's not the Torah that I cling to. And that's why I say, if we're going to live by this tree of life, we must open ourselves up to harvest new fruit every single year. This is why we read the Torah over and over again. And we read it anew every single year, because I know I get new insights from it every single year, and I hope you do too. I hope you're getting new insights from all of these great videos and all the teachings that have been presented in this series. And I think that's why the giving of Torah is connected intimately to the harvest of our sustenance, which must be renewed every single year. There's a saying in the Talmud, "Ein kemach ein Torah." If there's no flour, if there's no bread, there's no Torah. And I think it's very special that the giving of new wheat every year is connected to our opportunity to look at the Torah with fresh eyes. And I bless you with those fresh eyes this year. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart for doing this learning with me. I always enjoy learning with you. This time is no exception. And I want to wish all of you a Chag Shavuot Sameach. Please join us in the live stream at PJTC. And most important, if you learned anything at all, please comment on this video in the comment section below. If you have any comments, if you have any questions, anything I didn't explain very well, which is quite likely, just put your questions in the comments below. I said in the beginning a blessing to La'asok b'divrei Torah. Let's engage with this together. Let's carry this conversation on all week and into the year. And I'd love to share some of those comments in my talk on Shavuot this week, talks, I should say. In the meantime, you've been awesome. I've been Rabbi John Carrier, Pasadena Jewish Temple and Center. And until next time, Pasadenians and heroes everywhere, peace.